Greetings to our channel. Today we embark on a journey through the labyrinth of history to confront one of the most persistent and charged labels of the modern era. We are delving into the archives, tracing the ink of original decrees, and listening to the echoes of a past that many have tried to rewrite. Is the term apartheid a factual description of the state of Israel? Or is it a meticulously crafted psychological weapon forged in the fires of the Cold War? To understand the present, we must peel back the layers of decades-old propaganda and look at the raw, unvarnished evidence of how a nation was built on the premise of equality while surrounded by the flames of survival. We will examine the secret cables, the parliamentary debates of the 1940s, and the personal stories of those who lived through the transition from mandate to sovereignty. The documents tell a story far more complex and illuminating than any slogan could ever convey. So, let us begin. The heat in Tel Aviv on the 14th of May, 1948, was oppressive. Heavy with the scent of salt from the Mediterranean and the metallic tang of anxiety. Inside the modest building of the Tel Aviv Museum on Rothschild Boulevard, the air was stagnant, stirred only by the frantic movement of handheld fans and the hushed whispers of men in dark suits who knew they were about to challenge the tide of history. David Ben-Gurion stood at the wooden podium, his white hair a halo of defiance against the backdrop of a portrait of Theodor Herzl. The world outside was screaming with the sound of approaching armies, but inside, the focus was on a piece of parchment that would define the soul of a new state. When he began to read the Declaration of Independence, his voice did not tremble. He spoke of a nation that would be based on freedom, justice, and peace, as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. But it was the specific promise to the Arab inhabitants of the State of Israel that remains etched in the records of the Israel State Archives, file number ISA-State-Independence-1. The document explicitly called upon the Arab inhabitants of the State of Israel to preserve peace and participate in the upbuilding of the state on the basis of full and equal citizenship and due representation in all its provisional and permanent institutions. This was not the language of separation. It was a blueprint for integration, signed in the very hour of the nation's birth. In the dusty corridors of the early Israeli Ministry of Justice, located in the quiet streets of Jerusalem, a young clerk named Elias sat surrounded by stacks of files that smelled of damp limestone and cheap ink. It was 1949, and the first elections to the Knesset had just concluded. Elias, an Arab Christian from Haifa who had chosen to remain in the nascent state, watched as the results were tallied. He saw something that the history books in neighboring capitals would later ignore. Among the names of the first legislators were Saif el-Din el-Zubi and Amin Salim Jarjora, representing the Democratic list of Nazareth. These men were not tokens. They were participants in a radical experiment. They walked the same halls as the founders of the Labor Party, debated the same budget laws, and spoke from the same rostrum. The protocols of the first Knesset sessions, found in the records of the Knesset Secretariat, Volume 1, 1949, reveal heated exchanges where Arab members demanded infrastructure improvements for their villages and questioned the distribution of resources. They did so as citizens, protected by the very laws they were helping to draft. The notion that a racial hierarchy was being established is contradicted by the frantic, often messy reality of a multi-ethnic democracy struggling to find its footing during a ceasefire that felt like a prelude to more war. The archival records of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, specifically the 1952 dossiers on minority rights, show a government obsessed with the international perception of its democratic character. There was a profound awareness that the eyes of the world were watching to see if the Jewish state would replicate the exclusionary practices of the empires that had preceded it. Instead, the legal framework being constructed was one of universal suffrage. In the 1950s, while many established Western democracies still struggled with segregated schools or limited voting rights for minorities, Israel was issuing blue identity cards to every resident within its borders, regardless of their ethnic origin. The leather-bound ledgers of the Ministry of the Interior from that era record the registration of thousands of Arab families as full citizens. They were given the right to vote, the right to strike, and the right to seek redress in the High Court of Justice. This was a time when the echoes of the Holocaust were still fresh, yet the legislative priority was the creation of a unified legal space. The archives of the Prime Minister's Office, file number PMO-72B, contain internal memos from Ben-Gurion's advisors arguing that the strength of the state lay in the absolute loyalty of its Arab citizens, a loyalty that could only be earned through the guarantee of equal rights under the law. However, the narrative of, quote, one did not emerge from the reality on the ground in the Galilee or the Negev. It was a phantom born in the grand halls of international diplomacy and the secret offices of the first chief directorate of the KGB in Moscow. To understand the myth, one must look at the declassified documents from the Russian State Archive of Socio-Political History, known as RGA-SPI. During the mid-60s and early 70s, the Soviet Union realized that it could not defeat Israel on the battlefield through its proxies. Instead, it turned to the theater of psychological warfare. Operation SIG, a massive disinformation campaign, was launched to delegitimize the Zionist movement by linking it to the most hated ideologies of the 20th century. The goal was to isolate Israel from the newly independent nations of Africa and Asia. The Soviet archives reveal a systematic effort to plant articles in international newspapers, influence United Nations diplomats, and fund radical movements that would parrot the quote to mantra. They took the concept of apartheid from South Africa and through sheer repetition and political maneuvering, attempted to graft it onto a state that was, at that very moment, dismantling its own military administration over Arab areas. In the winter of 1966, a significant but often overlooked event occurred that shattered the structural arguments of those who claimed Israel was an apartheid state. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol announced the complete abolition of the military government that had overseen certain Arab-populated border zones since the War of Independence. The transition was documented in the secret minutes of the Ministerial Committee on Security Affairs, dated November 8, 1966. These documents, now declassified and available in the Israel State Archives, show a deliberate decision to move toward total civil integration. The military checkpoints were dismantled, the movement permits were burned, and the authority was handed over to civilian police and municipal governments. A witness to this transition, a veteran officer named Avraham, who had served in the administration in Nazareth, later wrote in his private diaries that the atmosphere was one of profound relief mixed with a cautious hope. He described seeing Arab neighbors and Jewish shopkeepers sharing coffee in the markets of Haifa, discussing the end of the restrictions as a victory for the common man. The legal barriers were gone, replaced by a singular civil code that applied from the northern hills of Lebanon to the southern tip of the Red Sea. The myth of separation also ignores the visceral reality of the Israeli healthcare system, a microcosm of the society that the archives rarely capture in dry statistics. The records of the Hadassah Medical Center from the early 1970s, specifically the admissions and staff registries, tell a story of profound coexistence. One could find a Jewish surgeon from Poland working side by side with an Arab pediatrician from Acre. In the wards, the language spoken was a tapestry of Hebrew and Arabic, and the care provided was indifferent to the politics of the day. The __quote_3__ label falls apart in the face of a reality where an Arab judge can sit on the Supreme Court and preside over the trial of a Jewish minister. This was not a future dream, but a developing reality, evidenced by the appointment of Justice Abdel Rahman Zouabi to the Supreme Court. The judicial archives from his tenure show a man who interpreted the law with a fierce independence, ensuring that the basic laws of the state protected every individual. The thick linen paper files of the court's decisions from the late 20th century are a testament to a legal system that, while imperfect, was fundamentally built on the principle of equality before the bench. The political landscape of the 1980s and 90s further reinforced this integration. The Central Elections Committee records show the increasing participation of Arab Israeli citizens in the democratic process. New parties were formed, alliances were made, and the Knesset became a vibrant, often loud, reflection of the country's diverse population. When one looks at the signatures on the state's budget laws or the environmental regulations of that era, the names of Arab legislators appear alongside those of their Jewish colleagues. There was no separate .4 or .5. There was only the law of the State of Israel. The archives of the Ministry of Education show the massive investment in the Arabic language school system, where the curriculum was designed to preserve the cultural and linguistic heritage of the Arab minority, while providing the tools for success in a modern economy. This was a state that recognized the unique identity of its citizens, without using that identity as a basis for exclusion. The data from the Central Bureau of Statistics, specifically the yearbooks from 1990 to 2000, show a steady rise in the standard of living, literacy rates, and life expectancy of Israel's Arab citizens, far outpacing the development in any neighboring Arab nation. Despite this mountain of evidence, the shadow of the myth continued to grow, fueled by the complex geopolitical struggles of the Middle East. The term apartheid became a convenient shorthand for critics who found the reality of a thriving, multi-ethnic Jewish democracy difficult to reconcile with their ideological goals. They pointed to the security measures necessitated by decades of conflict as evidence of racial separation, conveniently ignoring that these measures were applied based on security necessity, not ethnic classification. The confidential reports of the Shin, the Internal Security Service, from the period of the First and Second Intifadas, contain rigorous internal debates about the balance between security and civil liberties. These documents, some of which have been partially released under the Freedom of Information laws, show a deep-seated concern for maintaining the democratic fabric of the state, even under the most extreme pressure. The officials involved were acutely aware that every security wall or checkpoint was a temporary, painful necessity that ran counter to the long-term goal of a fully integrated society. They knew that the apartheid label was being sharpened as a knife in the halls of the United Nations, and they struggled to protect the nation without losing its soul. The archives of the United Nations in New York contain the transcripts of the debates leading up to the infamous Resolution 3379 in 1975. The air in the General Assembly chamber was thick with political maneuvering and the scent of expensive tobacco. The resolution, which equated Zionism with racism, was the culmination of the Soviet-led campaign to isolate Israel. The voting records show a world divided not by morality, but by the cold calculations of the oil embargo and the strategic interests of the Soviet bloc. The speech of Chaim Herzog, Israel's ambassador, remains a powerful rebuttal preserved in the UN archives. He stood before the assembly and literally tore the document in half, declaring that for the Jewish people, this resolution was based on hatred, falsehood, and arrogance. He pointed out the hypocrisy of nations with abysmal human rights records, accusing the only democracy in the Middle East of racism. The resolution was eventually revoked in 1991, a rare admission by the international community that the, quote, 8 charge was a political fabrication. Yet the seeds of the, quote, 9 myth had already been sown in the minds of a new generation. In the quiet residential streets of Jaffa, the architecture itself tells a story of these overlapping lives. The Ottoman-era stone houses with their arched windows stand next to modern Israeli apartment buildings. In the 1990s, a local historian named Miriam spent years documenting the oral histories of the families who lived there. Her notes, now part of the Jaffa Municipal Archives, describe a social fabric that was resilient and deeply intertwined. She interviewed Jewish families who had arrived from Yemen and Morocco, and Arab families who had been in Jaffa for generations. They shared recipes, looked after each other's children during the air raids of the Gulf War, and attended the same markets. One story stands out: an Arab doctor named Fuad, who saved the life of a Jewish child during a chaotic night in 1991. The child's father, a Holocaust survivor, later visited Fuad to thank him, and they sat on a balcony overlooking the sea. Two men bound by a common humanity that transcended the labels imposed by the outside world. This lived reality, captured in the fragile notebooks of a local historian, is the true face of Israel, the face that the Apartheid narrative seeks to mask with a veil of falsehood. The transition of the 20th century into the 21st saw Israel accelerating its role as a state of the future, where technology and intellect became the primary tools of defense and growth. The startup nation phenomenon was not limited to one segment of society. The records of the Ministry of Science and Technology from the early 2000s show a concerted effort to integrate Arab engineers and entrepreneurs into the high-tech ecosystem. Specialized incubators were established in Nazareth and Shfaram. The signatures on the founding documents of these centers represent a partnership between the state and its minority citizens to build a shared economic future. This was not the behavior of an apartheid regime. It was the strategy of a nation that understood its greatest resource was the collective intelligence of all its people. The rise of Arab-Israeli high-tech professionals, documented in the labor statistics of the era, shows a steady upward trajectory in participation and leadership roles. They were not just workers, they were founders, innovators, and investors who saw their future inextricably linked to the success of the Israeli state. In the vaults of the Israel Defense Forces archives, there are files that most people never see: the service records of non-Jewish volunteers. While military service is mandatory for Jewish citizens, thousands of Arab Israelis, particularly from the Druze and Circassian communities, but also growing numbers of Christians and Muslims, have chosen to serve. The records of the Sword Battalion and the Bedouin tracking units show a history of bravery and shared sacrifice that dates back to the 1950s. These soldiers did not serve a state that treats them as second-class citizens. They serve a country they consider their home. The medals for valor awarded to Arab soldiers, documented in the Ministry of Defense records, are a testament to a deep-rooted patriotism. A story from the archives mentions a Bedouin scout named Salim who, in the heat of a desert skirmish in the 1970s, risked his life to pull his Jewish commanding officer to safety. Their blood, spilled on the same sand, defied the simplistic categorizations of the propagandists. This shared burden of defense is perhaps the most powerful refutation of the separation myth, as it shows a society willing to trust its very survival to the hands of all its citizens. The legal battles of the 2000s further solidified the rights of the Arab minority. In the landmark Kaadan case, the Supreme Court ruled that the state could not discriminate against Arab citizens in the allocation of land for residential purposes. The court's opinion, written in the year 2000, referenced the very Declaration of Independence that Ben-Gurion had read in 1948. The justices affirmed that the principle of equality was a fundamental pillar of the state's constitutional identity. The transcripts of the hearings show a vigorous defense of civil rights by Arab-Israeli lawyers who used the state's own legal system to demand justice. This case, recorded in the Supreme Court Law Reports, Volume 54, is a cornerstone of Israeli jurisprudence. It demonstrates that the path to equality was not always smooth, but the mechanisms for achieving it were built into the very heart of the Israeli democracy. The quote, _1 4 label ignores these internal corrections and the vibrant, often confrontational role of the judiciary in protecting minority rights against the will of the majority. As we look back at the decades following the establishment of the state, the image that emerges from the archives is one of a nation in constant dialogue with its own ideals. It is the story of a people who, despite being surrounded by hostile regimes that often treated their own minorities with brutality, chose to build a society where the rule of law reigned supreme. The documents from the Ministry of Religious Affairs show the state's role in maintaining and protecting the holy sites of all faiths, providing salaries for imams and priests, and ensuring that religious courts had jurisdiction over personal status matters. This pluralistic approach is documented in the annual reports of the ministry, which detail the extensive cooperation between the state and the various religious leaderships. The quote, _1 5 narrative relies on a selective reading of history, ignoring the massive body of evidence that points toward a society characterized by complex integration and a persistent drive toward equality. It is a narrative that seeks to simplify a reality that is as multifaceted as the stones of Jerusalem themselves. And as we look deeper into the 1990s, we find the threads of this integration tightening even further. The diplomatic cables from the late 1990s, found in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs archives, reflect a period of intense optimism. The peace process with the Palestinians was at its height, and the internal focus was on strengthening the quote, _16 of all citizens. Memos from the Prime Minister's office during the Rabin and Peres administrations discuss the New Middle East, a vision where Israel would be a regional hub of cooperation. In this vision, the Arab citizens of Israel were seen as the natural bridge between the Jewish state and the wider Arab world. The archives show plans for joint industrial zones regional hospitals, and shared water management projects. These were not the plans of a state interested in racial separation, but of one seeking to dissolve the barriers of the past. The tragic assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in 1995 was a blow to this vision, but the institutional momentum toward integration continued. The records of the civil service from the following years show an increase in the recruitment of Arab citizens into senior government positions, reflecting a long-term commitment to a representative bureaucracy. The educational archives also reveal a significant shift during this period. The introduction of education for coexistence programs in both Jewish and Arab schools was a deliberate attempt to combat prejudice and build a shared civic identity. The curriculum materials, preserved in the National Library of Israel, emphasize the common history of the land and the importance of democratic values. These programs were not just academic exercises. They involved exchange programs, joint summer camps, and collaborative art projects. A teacher's diary from a school in Haifa in the late 90s describes the initial hesitation of the students, followed by the realization that their similarities far outweighed their differences. They spoke about music, sports, and their dreams for the future, finding a common language that bypassed the political rhetoric of the day. This grassroots integration, supported by state policy, is a crucial part of the historical record that is often ignored by those who seek to demonize the country with the Apartheid label. In the halls of the Knesset during the late 1990s, the presence of Arab parties became even more influential. The blocking bloc that supported the Rabin government was a clear demonstration of the political power of the Arab minority. The parliamentary records from that time show how Arab legislators were able to secure significant budget increases for their communities in exchange for their political support. This was a sophisticated exercise of democratic power, one that is impossible in an apartheid state. The archives of the Finance Committee contain the detailed negotiations over these budgets, showing the line item increases for roads, schools, and clinics in Arab towns. These documents provide a concrete financial refutation of the claim that the state was systematically neglecting its Arab citizens. Instead, they show a government responding to the political demands of a mobilized and effective minority, operating within a functioning democratic system. The psychological warfare that began in the Soviet era did not end with the fall of the Berlin Wall. It merely evolved. The apartheid label was picked up by new actors on the international stage, who found it to be a potent tool for delegitimizing Israel in the 21st century. But as we have seen, the archives tell a different story. They tell a story of a state founded on the principles of equality, a state that dismantled its own military restrictions, and a state that integrated its minority citizens into the highest levels of its government, judiciary, and economy. The real history of Israel is one of a struggle to maintain these ideals in the face of constant external threats. It is a history of a nation that refuses to be defined by the labels of its enemies. The documents, the laws, and the lived experiences of millions of people speak louder than any propaganda campaign. As we move closer to the present day, the evidence only becomes more overwhelming, painting a picture of a society that is a beacon of democracy in a region often shrouded in darkness. Yet, even with all these facts laid bare, a lingering question remains. Why does the myth persist? Why do some continue to ignore the evidence of the archives and the reality of the streets? Perhaps the answer lies in a truth that is more uncomfortable than the lie. In the basement of an old government building in Jerusalem, there is a collection of files that has never been fully publicized. The records of the Integration Committee from the early 2000s. These files contain transcripts of meetings where officials discussed the potential for a truly unified society, one where the labels of Jew and Arab would be secondary to the identity of Israeli. They spoke of a future that was so transformative, so challenging to the status quo of the entire Middle East, that some feared the repercussions of its success. They saw that a truly integrated Israel would be a living refutation of every radical ideology in the region. The documents suggest that the truth of Israel's integration is not just a defense against a myth, but a blueprint for a future that many are not yet ready to accept. It seems the most dangerous thing about the truth is not its complexity, but its power to change the world. The shadow of the myth continues to loom, but the paper fortress of the archives stands firm. Every decree, every court ruling, and every personal testimony adds a brick to the wall of reality. The story of Israel is not one of separation, but of a persistent, often difficult journey toward a shared destiny. The evidence is there for anyone willing to look. The signatures on the documents, the names on the ballots, and the faces in the hospitals and tech hubs. The Apartheid label is a relic of a Cold War disinformation campaign, a phantom that vanishes when exposed to the light of historical fact. As the sun sets over the limestone hills of Judea, casting long shadows over the ancient and modern city, the truth remains etched in the records, waiting to be fully understood by those who seek it. The final files of the 1990s transition period, specifically those dealing with the National Service initiatives for Arab youth, show a government trying to create new pathways for civic participation. The correspondence between the Ministry of Labor and various Arab municipal leaders reflects a shared desire to provide young people with the skills and opportunities they needed to thrive. These letters, often written in both Hebrew and Arabic, are filled with a sense of practical cooperation. They discuss vocational training, community service projects, and the development of local infrastructure. This was a period of building, not of dividing. The apartheid charge ignores these thousands of small, everyday acts of partnership that define the relationship between the state and its citizens. It is a story of a nation that is constantly evolving, constantly striving to live up to the promises made on that hot May day in 1948. As the decade drew to a close, the records of the Ministry of Interior showed a surge in the number of Arab Israelis participating in municipal elections, taking control of their own local affairs within the framework of the state. The archives of these local councils provide a rich history of grassroots democracy, where local leaders work to improve the lives of their constituents while navigating the complexities of national politics. These records show a vibrant political culture, with debates over zoning, education, and social services. This was not a population that was silenced or excluded. It was a population that was deeply engaged in the democratic life of the country. The apartheid myth is a denial of this agency, a refusal to see the Arab citizens of Israel as the active, influential participants in their society that they truly are. The transition into the new millennium was marked by both challenge and achievement. The archives of the 2000s show a nation grappling with the realities of the Second Intifada while simultaneously pushing forward with its vision of a high-tech, integrated future. The documents from this era reflect a profound resilience, a determination to maintain the democratic character of the state even in the face of extreme violence. The records of the Orr Commission, which investigated the clashes of October 2000, show a state willing to critically examine its own actions and the relationship between its Jewish and Arab citizens. This commission, led by a Supreme Court justice, produced a report that was a landmark in the history of Israeli democracy, calling for greater equality and integration. The fact that such a commission could even exist and that its findings were debated and implemented is a powerful testament to the strength of Israel's democratic institutions and its commitment to the rule of law. The story of the archives is a story of a nation that is never static, always pushing toward its next chapter. The myth of apartheid is a static, frozen label that bears no resemblance to the dynamic, evolving reality of the State of Israel. The documents tell a story of a people who have built something unique, a democracy that is both Jewish and pluralistic, a state that is both ancient and futuristic. The apartheid charge is an attempt to erase this history, to simplify a complex and inspiring journey into a single, hateful word. But the archives do not lie. They remain a silent but powerful witness to the truth of a nation that has always sought to be a light unto the nations and a home for all its people. In the quiet hours of the night, when the archives are closed and the city is still, one can almost feel the weight of these millions of pages of history. They are the foundation upon which the state is built, the evidence of its struggles and its triumphs. The apartheid label is a shadow that dances on the wall, but the foundation itself is solid, made of law, of sacrifice, and of a persistent hope for a better future. The truth is there, in the ink and the parchment, for anyone who has the courage to look beyond the slogans and see the reality of a nation that continues to defy the expectations of the world. This was the state of play as the 20th century faded, but the most revealing documents were yet to be uncovered. In the following years, a new set of records would emerge, shedding light on a secret initiative that aimed to bridge the final gaps in Israeli society. These files, kept under high security for years, hint at a level of cooperation that would shock those who believe the myths of the past. The journey through the archives is far from over, and the truth, as it turns out, is even more compelling than we imagined. The historical records from the late 20th century transition into the new millennium reveal a state that was not only surviving, but was actively reconstructing its social contract under the most grueling conditions. While the phantom of the apartheid myth continued to be exported by international adversaries, the internal reality of Israel was characterized by a profound, albeit complex, deepening of civil integration. The bridge between the era of foundational struggles and the high-tech sovereignty of the 21st century was built on the quiet work of thousands of individuals who refused to let ideology override the shared necessity of coexistence. In the archives of the Prime Minister's office, specifically the cabinet minutes from the year 2001, one can find the echoes of a government struggling to maintain its democratic ideals while facing the waves of the Second Intifada. The discussions were not about separation, but about how to protect the civil rights of the Arab minority during a time of intense national security crisis. The documents show a deliberate refusal to resort to the draconian measures seen in truly segregated societies. A pivotal moment in this unfolding narrative can be found in the career of Justice Salim Joubran, whose life and work are documented in the judicial archives of the Supreme Court of Israel. In the year 2004, he became the first Arab Israeli to receive a permanent appointment to the nation's highest court. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a testament to the meritocratic nature of a system that allowed a man from a minority background to reach the pinnacle of legal authority. The transcripts of the trials over which he presided show a judge of immense integrity, a man who sat in judgment of the country's most powerful figures including former presidents and prime ministers. In 2011, Justice Gibran was part of the three-judge panel that upheld the rape conviction of former President Moshe Katsav. The historical irony was profound. An Arab judge sentencing a Jewish former head of state to prison. This reality, preserved in the court's official case files, shatters the Apartheid label, proving that the law in Israel is a singular, blind force that recognizes only the evidence, not the ethnicity of the defendant or the judge. Beyond the marble halls of the Supreme Court, the state of the future was being built in the laboratories and lecture halls of the Technion, Israel Institute of Technology in Haifa. The registrar's records from the last 2 decades show a dramatic and steady increase in the enrollment of Arab Israeli students in the most challenging fields of study. By the year 2020, nearly 20% of the student body was Arab, a figure that mirrors their proportion in the general population. The files of the Student Dean's Office contain stories of young women from traditional villages in the Galilee who, within a few years, became leading experts in nanotechnology and computer science. These archives record the awarding of scholarships, the funding of research projects, and the hiring of Arab professors who became world-renowned leaders in their fields. This intellectual integration was the result of a conscious national policy to harness the brainpower of all citizens to maintain Israel's qualitative edge. The Quote 36, as some researchers called it, was not built by one group alone, but by a collective effort of a society that understood its survival depended on the shared genius of its people. In the shadowed basements of the Ministry of Finance, the paper trail of __quote_37__ tells a story of economic transformation that few outside the country fully understood. This landmark cabinet decision, passed in December 2015, authorized the largest ever investment in the Arab sector, 15 billion shekels, aimed at closing the gaps in infrastructure, education, and employment. The budget books, thick with spreadsheets and technical annexes, show a systematic attempt to redirect the nation's wealth toward its minority communities. The records of the Ministry for Social Equality describe the intense negotiations between government officials and the heads of Arab local councils. They met in nondescript office buildings in Jerusalem, poring over maps of the Galilee and the Negev, planning new industrial zones, public transport lines, and high-tech parks. A senior economist involved in the project later wrote in his memoirs that the atmosphere was one of pragmatic partnership. He noted that the survival of the Israeli economy was inextricably linked to the prosperity of the Arab middle class. This was a state acting in its own rational self-interest to ensure that every citizen was a stakeholder in the national success story. The onset of the global pandemic in early 2020 provided the ultimate test of this social fabric. The records of the Ministry of Health from that era, specifically the reports of the Magen Israel Task Force, show an unprecedented level of cooperation between the central government and the Arab leadership. Ayman Saif, a veteran civil servant who had led the economic development of the Arab sector for years, was appointed to lead the pandemic response in the Arab community. The archives contain the daily logs of his meetings with imams, local mayors, and health professionals. They worked together to set up testing centers, launch vaccination campaigns, and manage local lockdowns. The data from that period shows that the health outcomes in Arab towns were often comparable to, or even better than, those in the Jewish sector, thanks to this localized and culturally sensitive approach. The photographs in the ministry's archive show Jewish and Arab medics working side by side in overcrowded hospital wards, their faces obscured by masks, but their hands united in the labor of saving lives. This was not a society divided by walls of separation, but one bound together by the common thread of a virus that recognized no borders and no ethnic identities. The political landscape underwent a seismic shift in the year 2021, an event that left international critics of Israel struggling to maintain their __quote _39 narrative. For the first time in the country's history, an independent Arab party, Ra'am, led by Mansour Abbas, joined the governing coalition. The coalition agreement, a document preserved in the Knesset archives, was a masterpiece of political pragmatism. It focused on the day-to-day needs of the Arab citizenry, housing, crime prevention, and economic development, rather than on the divisive ideological battles of the past. The minutes of the Ministerial Committee on Arab Affairs during this period show Mansour Abbas sitting at the cabinet table, participating in the most sensitive decisions of the state. He was not a guest, he was a partner with the power to make or break the government. The sight of a devout Muslim leader negotiating the national budget with a Zionist prime minister was a powerful refutation of the separation myth. This experiment in power sharing, documented in the official parliamentary records, proved that the Israeli democratic system was flexible enough to accommodate the most diverse interests, provided there was a willingness to engage in the hard work of governance. The archives of the Ministry of Education from the same period reveal a quiet revolution in the teaching of the Hebrew language and Israeli civics in Arab schools. The goal was not to erase the cultural identity of the Arab students, but to provide them with the keys to the Israeli __quote _40 _. The curriculum files show a shift toward practical skills, high-level mathematics, and bilingualism. In the quiet libraries of Nazareth and Acre, researchers have documented the rise of a new generation of Arab Israelis who are equally comfortable in their own heritage and in the fast-paced world of Tel Aviv high-tech. These students were not being assimilated into a monolithic culture. They were being integrated into a shared national future. The diaries of teachers from this era describe the intense debates in the classrooms, where students questioned their place in the state while simultaneously striving to become its doctors, engineers, and pilots. This tension was not a sign of failure, but of a vibrant, living democracy where the identity of the citizen was constantly being negotiated and refined. In the coastal city of Jaffa, the local archives from the 2020s record the complex reality of __quote _41 where Jewish and Arab residents live in the same apartment buildings and shop at the same local groceries. The municipal records of the __quote _42 describe the daily efforts to resolve disputes over noise, parking, and religious holidays. These documents show a society that is not perfect, but one that has developed sophisticated mechanisms for managing friction. They record the __quote _43 events, where families of different faiths shared meals and stories, and the joint protests where Jewish and Arab neighbors stood together against rising housing prices. This lived reality, captured in the mundane files of a city hall, is a direct contradiction to the image of a state divided by racial laws. It is the story of a messy, beautiful, an often difficult coexistence that persists despite the attempts of outsiders to define it by a single inflammatory word. The defense of the nation in the 21st century also reflected this deep-seated integration. The records of the Ministry of Defense, specifically the __quote _44 unit, show a steady increase in the number of Muslim and Christian Arabs volunteering for national service in the Israel Defense Forces. The files contain the stories of soldiers like Lieutenant Colonel Ella Waweya, the first female Muslim Arab to reach that rank in the IDF. Her service record is a testament to the fact that the defense of the state is seen by many of its citizens as a shared responsibility. The archives record the funerals of Arab soldiers who fell in battle, where the Kaddish and the Janazah were recited in the same military cemeteries. This shared sacrifice, documented in the somber records of the Department of Families and Commemoration, is perhaps the most visceral evidence that Israel is a home for all its people. These soldiers do not fight for an __quote_45__ regime. They fight for a country that they believe offers them and their families the best hope for a secure and prosperous future in a turbulent region. The role of Arab women in the Israeli workforce is another chapter of the __quote _46__ documented in the files of the Central Bureau of Statistics. The data from the last decade shows a significant jump in the employment rates of Arab women, particularly in the healthcare and education sectors. This transformation was supported by state-funded vocational training and daycare centers, as evidenced by the records of the Ministry of Labor. These women became the primary agents of change in their communities, bridging the gap between traditional values and the demands of a modern economy. The archives of the __quote _47__ show the rising income levels of Arab families, driven by this dual income revolution. This economic empowerment was not just about money. It was about the dignity of work and the integration of a marginalized group into the core of the national life. The __quote _48__ narrative fails to account for this massive, state-supported upward mobility that has fundamentally altered the social landscape of the country. The archival records of the Israel Land Authority from the 2020s show a concerted effort to address the historical grievances regarding land allocation in the Arab sector. New master plans were approved for dozens of Arab towns, allowing for the construction of thousands of new housing units and the development of modern infrastructure. The minutes of the planning commissions record the intense participation of Arab architects and urban planners who worked to ensure that the development met the unique cultural and social needs of their communities. These files, filled with blueprints and zoning maps, represent a tangible commitment to rectifying the inequalities of the past. While the process was often slow and bureaucratic, the direction was clear: a movement toward parity and the integration of Arab towns into the national development framework. This was not the work of a regime interested in separation, but of a state that recognized the stability of its land management depended on the satisfaction of all its inhabitants. The myth of __quote _49__ also falls apart when examined through the lens of international law and the records of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Declassified memos from the legal department analyze the differences between the South African model of racial segregation and the Israeli system of universal citizenship. The lawyers noted that in Israel, there are no laws that prohibit marriage between different ethnic groups, no laws that restrict the movement of citizens based on race, and no laws that segregate public facilities. The quote _50_, often cited by critics, is documented in the Ministry of Defense archives as a temporary security measure built during a wave of suicide bombings, not a tool of racial policy. The internal maps show how the route was repeatedly adjusted by the Supreme Court to minimize the impact on local populations, often following petitions filed by Arab-Israeli lawyers. This legal oversight, preserved in the court's permanent records, demonstrates a system that is constantly checking its own power and ensuring that security needs do not override the fundamental rights of individuals. As the third decade of the 21st century unfolds, the archives of the Ministry of Science and Technology show Israel positioning itself as a global leader in environmental and medical innovation. This vision of the future is inclusive by design. The records of the quote _51__ in the Galilee and the Triangle show joint projects between Jewish and Arab scientists on water conservation, sustainable agriculture, and personalized medicine. These centers, funded by the state, are hubs of intellectual cooperation where the primary language is the language of science. The correspondence between these researchers reflects a shared sense of mission to solve the challenges of the future for the benefit of all humanity. This is the quote _52__ in action, where the intellect is used not just for defense, but for the creation of a better world. The quote _53__ label is a relic of a darker past, one that is increasingly irrelevant to the reality of a nation that is building its future on the foundation of shared knowledge and collective effort. The shadow of the Soviet-era disinformation campaign still lingers in certain international forums, but the light of the archives is becoming harder to ignore. The Russian State Archive of Socio-Political History still contains the original blueprints for the delegitimization of Israel, but those same strategies are now being countered by the sheer weight of historical fact. The records of the United Nations, once a primary battleground for the quote _54__ charge, now reflect a more nuanced and often supportive view of Israel's democratic character, as seen in the reports of various human rights monitors who have visited the country. While criticisms remain, they are increasingly focused on specific policies rather than on the foundational legitimacy of the state. The apartheid charge is being relegated to the fringes of the political discourse, used primarily by those who have a vested interest in the continuation of conflict. For those who care to look at the documents, the truth is plain to see. Israel is a complex, struggling, but fundamentally democratic nation that has chosen integration over separation at every critical juncture of its history. In the quiet, climate-controlled rooms of the National Library of Israel in Jerusalem, a new generation of historians is beginning to piece together the full story of this integration. They are looking at the digital archives, the social media records, and the oral histories of a society that is more connected than ever before. They find a country where a Jewish teenager in Tel Aviv and an Arab teenager in Nazareth listen to the same music, use the same apps, and dream of the same high-tech careers. They find a country where the lines of division are being blurred by the realities of everyday life. These researchers are documenting the birth of a new Israeliness that is broader and more inclusive than anything that came before. Their work, preserved in the library's vast database, is the final refutation of the myth. It is the story of a people who have refused to be defined by the hatred of their enemies and have instead chosen to build a home where everyone has a seat at the table. The weight of the evidence is overwhelming, but the story is not yet over. In the deepest recesses of the state archives, there are still files that are restricted, marked with the highest level of security. These are the records of the most sensitive negotiations, the most daring operations, and the most difficult decisions made by the leaders of the state. Some say these files contain proof of a secret plan to finally resolve the remaining tensions within Israeli society, a plan so ambitious that it could change the entire landscape of the Middle East. Others whisper about a quote _57_ that outlines a future of total integration. A map that has been followed in secret for decades. Whether these rumors are true or not, the documents that are already public tell a story of a nation that has consistently moved toward the light. The journey from the museum on Rothschild Boulevard to the high-tech hubs of today is a journey of a people who have proved that intellect and democracy are the strongest defenses of all. As the Jerusalem wind howls through the narrow alleys of the old city, carrying the sounds of 100 different voices, the paper fortress of the archives remains a silent sentinel. The ink on the old decrees has faded, but the spirit of the laws they established is more alive than ever. The quote _58_ myth was a weapon forged in another era, a phantom that cannot survive the scrutiny of the truth. The real history of Israel is written in the lives of its 2 million Arab citizens and its 7 million Jewish citizens, who together are building a future that defies the expectations of the world. It is a future based on the simple, radical idea that all people are equal under the law, and that a nation's strength lies in the unity of its diverse people. This is the truth that is too dangerous for some to acknowledge, but it is the truth that will ultimately prevail. The archives are open, the evidence is clear, and the story of the State of Israel continues to be written every day in the hearts and minds of all its citizens. The sun begins to set over the Mediterranean, casting a golden glow over the skyline of Tel Aviv, where the towers of industry and innovation stand as monuments to what a free people can achieve. In the hospitals, the night shift begins, with Jewish and Arab doctors handing over their patients to the next team. In the high-tech parks, the servers continue to hum, processing the data that will drive the global economy of tomorrow. In the quiet villages of the Galilee, the lamps are lit in the windows of homes where the next generation of Israeli citizens is studying for their exams. This is the living archive, the reality that no slogan can erase. The quote _59_ state is a fiction, a shadow on the wall of history. The real Israel is a vibrant, multi-ethnic, and unshakable democracy that has learned to protect its soul while defending its borders. The truth is not hidden in the shadows. It is out in the open, in the streets, the courts, and the laboratories of a nation that has always looked toward the future. In the final assessment, the question of whether Israel is an apartheid state is answered not by the rhetoric of its critics, but by the tangible evidence of its history. The archives show a state that has consistently chosen inclusion over exclusion, law over chaos, and hope over despair. They show a nation that has integrated a large and diverse minority into every aspect of its national life, from the highest court to the most secret laboratory. This achievement, made in the face of constant external threats, is one of the great untold stories of the 20th and 21st centuries. The myth of apartheid is a lie that serves only those who wish to see the destruction of the only democracy in the Middle East. But the documents remain, the facts are clear, and the truth is a fortress that cannot be breached. As we close the files on this investigation, we are left with the image of a country that is a beacon of light in a region of shadows, a home for all its people, and a testament to the power of the human spirit to build a better future. A final, curious document remains in the private collection of a retired diplomat, a letter written in 1999 by a high-ranking official in a neighboring Arab state. The letter, which has never been officially published, expresses a secret admiration for the way Israel had managed to integrate its Arab citizens while maintaining its Jewish identity. The writer noted that if his own country could achieve even a fraction of that social cohesion, the entire region would be transformed. He spoke of the, quote, 60 as something to be studied in secret, a blueprint for a future that was still too dangerous to discuss in public. This letter, hidden away for decades, suggests that even Israel's most ardent enemies knew the truth. They saw the strength that came from a truly integrated society, and they feared it more than any army. The reality of Israel's integration was, and remains, the most potent weapon in its arsenal. The archives are silent now. The heavy doors of the vaults locked for the night. But the story they contain is far from over. It is a story that is being lived every day by the millions of people who call the State of Israel their home. It is a story of a nation that has always known that its greatest resource is not the land, but the people who live on it. The quote, 61 myth is a relic of a past that never was, a shadow that disappears in the light of the sun. The real history of Israel is a story of struggle, of triumph, and of a persistent, unyielding commitment to the ideals of freedom and equality for all. As the stars come out over the Judean desert, the truth remains, a steady and unwavering light in a world that is often lost in the darkness. The files are closed, but the evidence remains. One last artifact sits on a shelf in a small museum in the Galilee. A joint declaration signed by the Jewish and Arab mayors of several neighboring towns in the year 2022. It is a simple document, written in both Hebrew and Arabic, pledging to work together for the common good of all their residents. It speaks of shared parks, shared schools, and a shared future. The signatures at the bottom are firm, the ink still dark and clear. It is a small piece of paper, but it carries the weight of a nation's history and the promise of its future. In the end, the truth of Israel is found not in the grand declarations of international bodies, but in these small, quiet acts of partnership. The myth of separation is dead, and in its place is the reality of a country that is building a home for everyone. The final page of the archive is still blank, waiting to be written by the generation that will take the state of the future into the next century. The evening air in Jerusalem is cold now, the ancient stones of the city reflecting the moonlight. In the distance, The lights of the Knesset continue to burn, where the business of the state goes on late into the night. The documents are back in their boxes, the secrets preserved for another day. But the truth of the state of the future is already out there, in the hearts of the people who live and breathe its air. The myth is gone, and the reality remains, as solid and enduring as the hills themselves. The journey through the archives is complete, and the evidence is final. Israel is a nation of many voices, but one shared destiny. The paper fortress is held, and the light of the future is bright. The last box is placed on the shelf, labeled with the year 2026. Inside are the latest reports on the economic integration of the Negev, the records of new joint ventures in medical technology, and the transcripts of a Knesset session led by an Arab deputy speaker. The archive is a living thing, constantly growing, constantly proving that the path of the state is one of unity. The labels of the past have no place here. The future is being built on a different foundation, one that the world is only just beginning to understand. The truth is simple, and it is right before our eyes. The state of Israel stands as a testament to what is possible when a people chooses intellect over force and integration over myth. The shadows are gone, and only the light remains.